One of the things I wanted to chat about, this is a part in the local first space that I felt a lot about, is that there's this common problem because you have these distributed apps that are like syncing data across devices. If you change the schema of an app, that can cause a ton of problems. This is like what I think of as one of the hard, mostly unsolved problems in the space. But I'm curious, like, how you think about that. How do you think about schema changes and how that impacts like sync data over Jazz?
Yeah, as any local first framework developer will tell you, that's literally the hardest part of local first. And even to complete newcomers to local first, the way I sell it to them is, look, it makes all of these really hard things really easy. But there's one thing that's cursed now, which is migration. And what we've realized in practice by building apps ourselves with Jazz and with our early adopters, helping them evolve their apps as they start to need their first migrations. First, the way it looks in Jazz is that migrations are attached to an account. So on the client, before it launches into your app, it sees if there are any migrations that needs to run on the data rooted in your account. And that's a chance for you to define those. And right now it's a bit Wild West. You can do any kind of mutation in the migration. It's up to you to do it in a way that won't cause problems. And the main pattern to follow here really is think about it not as a centralized database migration, but that like you stop the world, you make sure it's the same everywhere, but think of it as protocol evolution, particularly if you're familiar with something like protobuf or even GraphQL schemas, where the philosophy is you never remove fields, you only ever add new fields. If you do that with Jazz, you typically don't run into any problems. And even if you have some old clients that haven't done the migration yet, the inter is still as best as it is possible theoretically. So over time, as we see more and more apps and really crystallize these patterns, we will probably provide guardrails. Well, maybe with some typing help, we make sure that you can only do migrations that have these properties and so on. But right now, it's just up to you. And obviously, we help you with it.
So the exciting part to me about Jazz when I read the docs is it like reimagines what a backend could be. Really exemplifies that for me as file uploads, as you said. There's literally like people are create whole services just to make file uploads easy because they're just so hard, which is crazy since it's like one of our default actions on the web. But what other parts of the backend do you want to consume into this platform that is Jazz?
So obviously, it needs to do more things that databases traditionally do. A big one is queries and search indices, where right now one of the surprising things is that very often, because it is such a like user-first perspective, you can actually load all of the data of a user or even a whole org into the client. Again, we had here one of the special things about Jazz is you don't have to. It has very granular sync. That's something we can get into. It kind of sets it apart. But still, over time, as you load everything in your org by looking at it, you can actually have all of that on the client. And very often what would traditionally be a database query with an index is literally like a brute force JavaScript .filter map over everything. And that's still super fast. But as we're starting to see local first app where you are dealing with hundreds of thousands or millions of objects, you do want search indices over those where you can quickly look up items by their properties, everything that you would expect from a traditional database index. The fun thing is we can just pull that into Jazz as well. Clients and or server workers could collaboratively maintain the index, and the index gets synced as an object just like everything else. So you get some really fun properties there. And over time, I want Jazz to be more and more what looks like a distributed database that's exploded into its part that does everything you need. And you pick and choose what you want to build. In a sense, it might feel a bit like Redis, where Redis doesn't really give you a full-blown database. It gives you like the building blocks for a database, and then you assemble those into what you need for your app. And that's probably how like search indices will feel like in Jazz. Obviously, part of that these days is also being able to do vector search. So we're like, what is every feature that people need from a database and similar systems like blob storage nowadays, and how can we make that work with the co-values? So far, the indication seems to be that surprisingly, you can just do all of it with Jazz. And I feel like philosophically, there's a good reason for it, because the way I started seeing traditional stacks is they're just a very manual way of creating shared state for like structured and unstructured data between users and devices that just follows this established pattern of you have a backend, you have a database, and you have clients. But there's no fundamental reason for why it should be structured like like that. And if you turn the problem around and you're like, what's an abstraction for sharing state and making sync your main way to do that? Suddenly everything that you need can fit into that model. So that's what we're trying to do with Jazz, and not just like theoretically, but including all the battery and pragmatic like bindings that you might need to actually get your app off the ground.
That's so cool. You can find solutions like that where it's like you just have this encrypted file store that's automatically synced.
Exactly.
One of the things, as you're talking through this, that I think is interesting to touch on is like the limitations. Local first apps are very user-centric. It's like a database per user. Usually they're working with smaller set of data, and that gives us a lot of leeway to experiment with ideas that just aren't performant at a scale of like 10 million users or 100 million users or whatever. But as you're talking about more distributed database stuff, scales become an issue. So what problems do you think that Jazz is going to be well suited for in the space? And at what point do you say, okay, this is like a little bit beyond Jazz's scale or not a problem that we're trying to solve?
So two things come to mind. And again, I'm very radical here in the sense that I want Jazz to do as much as possible, like really. One is that right now it's best suited for greenfield apps just because we haven't really explored the like syncing Jazz state with a traditional database very much, which I think you need in almost all cases where you want to gradually adopt Jazz. You could build that by hand right now, and we would be very happy to help you too. Just so far, we found that the people who try out Jazz and adopt Jazz, they're building something completely new where they can really do everything with Jazz. And then obviously we have features to catch up with there in terms of unblocking different kinds of apps. The other thing is, and I want to be really precise here because developers are very keen to optimize, and this is usually the part that sounds scariest to them, but Jazz does keep the full edit history of everything you ever do to a co-value. The performance limit of that is way higher than you think it is. So for example, something like user presence, where you like record cursor movement into a co-value. It's like by default, a lot of other frameworks create a separate abstraction for like ephemeral state, where it's basically just publish, subscribe, and then you never hear of it again. The reason we say it's fine in Jazz to keep all that history is because even if you record cursor movements for a whole year continuously, it's not that much data. It's like a couple megabytes. And it might actually be useful to keep it around if you want to have a call recording feature or something like that in your app. So that's one thing that we're really expanding people's conception of what you can do on modern computers. The one thing where I'm like, no, you absolutely can't do that with Jazz is people asking me if they can build like real-time simulation games and store the state of that in a co-value. Well, if it's a turn-based game, absolutely easily fits. But if you have a 3D world with physics, don't try to build a multiplayer game with Jazz. You could in theory, but you would run into scaling issues there. That's like the main one. Other than that, almost any type of app should be fine. And if you run into performance issues, I consider that a bug. And we've been lucky to already have really diverse early adopters so far, where, for example, one of them is literally building kind of a social network. So they have something like close to a couple million visitors each week. And I don't know exactly how tightly interacting they are, but that's something that's very out of scope for the default assumption of what people have for local first. They're basically just using Jazz like a traditional database to, I should probably say what it is. It's like a learning platform that's structured a bit like where people can, in a user-generated way, collect good links and materials if you want to learn, like, for example, Rust or how to play the guitar or whatever. And they get from SE lots of first-time users, and then they like render this page of lots of material out of Jazz for this user one time. They might not even ever come back, but that's a very different usage pattern from what you would expect from a typical local first apps, where you have small teams that interact mostly with the same data again and again that they keep locally. And we had to stretch Jazz a little bit, but it only took us a week to basically optimize it for that use case. And that's the approach we will take. And that's only possible because of what I briefly mentioned earlier, that Jazz takes the default route of granularly loading data and not making you define ahead of time as a developer what is like a box of content that we can load as a unit. With a lot of other frameworks, it's either database per client or organization, or you have to come up with some delineation of what is a document in our app, and then that's the unit of what you can sync. As I mentioned when I described the co-values, it's specifically built as like this giant infinite graph of co-values that can reference each other. And that means that the individual co-values can actually be quite small, and that's what makes it more scalable as well. And then you just resolve those references for as deeply as you need for each particular view of the UI. Optimization patterns like pagination work exactly the same way. And in addition to that, you could explicitly choose what you always want to keep offline to make an app work offline. But because of that granularity, the scalability actually is already quite good, even though the code is like horribly unoptimized at the moment.
So a thing with React apps is having like local versus global state. In a Jazz world, do I just like kind of default everything to Jazz since that's like the nice base layer?
Yeah, and that has two really fun properties where it turns out like even just UI state management is a huge topic in and of itself, and there's like hundreds of frameworks around it. With Jazz, if you just build everything around co-values, you can do something very fun where like literally like leaf components can subscribe to different co-values by ID, and you could subscribe to the same co-value from 100 different places in your UI without having to coordinate between those. Under the hood, Jazz deduplicates that for you and just attaches these as different subscribers to the same co-value. And that actually makes it a lot easier to build front-end code, which means that you're more likely to use it for more stuff in your front end, which means that stuff that you would never have thought of even syncing before, like how far down did you scroll in this document, and maybe you want to sync that to other devices, you now have the option to do that. And Jazz is actually, funnily enough, more convenient to use than good old local state that's not even synced.
That's a really fascinating concept, especially I'm thinking about historical usage data. Suddenly you get these analytics use cases falling out.
Sorry, one more point as well, because you framed it as global state. One slogan that I really like is that the problem with global state is actually that it's not global enough and we're making it even more global.